I'm Jim Kunkel, and welcome to Build Out. On today's episode, I actually have a great guest, a good friend of mine, Stuart Saulters, who's the Vice President of Government Relations with the American Public Gas Association. Stuart, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Jim. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, we're going to have a great conversation today on government relations and try to kind of understand exactly what it means related to the topic of government relations and what goes into it. Before we start our conversation, could you do me a favor, provide information and background on yourself? And also, if you could talk a little bit about the APGA and what it does as an organization.
Yeah, happy to. Again, my name is Stuart Saulters. I currently serve as the Vice President of Government Relations for the American Public Gas Association, or APGA. Prior to that, I worked for the American Petroleum Institute, doing government relations work. Specifically for API, I was focused on pipeline safety policy. So, for some of you out there, you may be familiar with the Department of Transportation, specifically the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA. A lot of my work at API was dealing with the good folks over at PHMSA on regulations, new and old, and complying, all that fun stuff. Before I decided to veer off into government relations land, I worked for Chevron as a facility engineer and a design engineer. So, your background, Jim, of Pittsburgh, I actually spent four good years in Pittsburgh. Working for Chevron, doing some work on the well sites they had in Western PA and Eastern Ohio. And so, just a little more on APGA. So, we represent the public gas utilities across the country. They are located in 38 states, and there's about 1,000 of them. So, everybody from the town of Redbird, Oklahoma, which has 5 customers or 5 meters, to Philadelphia Gas Works in Eastern PA, which has a lot more than 5 customers. I can't remember exactly how many customers they have, but they are the biggest public gas utility, and we represent them. So, wide range that we have the responsibility of speaking for here in Washington, D.C.
Excellent, excellent. Appreciate that background and information on the APGA and the good work that the organization does in the industry. When we talk about government relations, a lot of people focus on the federal side, but we have to also look at local, state, and importantly, it would be the federal side. And some of the reasons why it's so important to have a relation side, let's say with government, is an information exchange and getting information to elected officials, talk about industry topics depending on what industry you're in, but also to get engagement to try to understand exactly what is currently on the books, let's say when it comes to regulation in certain industries, but also to what could come down the road for regulations. And then the other thing I think a lot of thing is really clarifying a lot of the head trash that might exist in some of the industries. When you look at government relations, what is your definition of why it's important to have government relations as an organization?
Yeah, it's very important. I think we get some pushback because we're not a revenue generating we don't serve as a revenue generating role, especially as a trade association. A lot of the colleagues I have that work for individual utilities or work for individual energy companies in a government relations role similarly face the challenge of trying to show their wealth or show their worth to the folks that maybe do more of those revenue generating roles. And so, I like to think, and you really hit the nail on the head, Jim, but it's really that relationship building. And so, most of the time, you're building those relationships, you're engaging with policymakers, like you said, on all levels. Here I am in DC. It's true, APGA does have a focus on federal policymakers, but
Mhm.
at the same time, we're not losing sight of the relationships at the state level, the relationships at the local level, especially for us, because being public utilities, all of our engagement is with a utility board or a city council when it comes to rates and different operations and maintenance, and so a lot more interaction with that local policymaker. But the focus is relationship building. And so, for a couple reasons, if legislation or regulation is coming, then you have that relationship to have a conversation with those policymakers, both
Mhm.
elected, senators, representatives, as well as, like I mentioned earlier, the folks at PHMSA, for instance. But then also too, I think I was chatting with a colleague earlier, and we were talking about some of the security aspects of pipelines, and so cybersecurity and physical security. And so, if the unfortunate event that you have an incident, the last, or I guess the worst time for you to meet those folks will be during that incident. And so, from a government relations standpoint, it's just really important to have relationships and to have good rapport with the folks that oversee your operations, or potentially could legislate laws that would affect you.
Yeah, when you think of the relationships, it's really to, influence and improve public policy in addition to also to getting information out into these elected officials, state and local, and also federal. Because a lot of times these are big issues, especially when you're dealing in oil and gas industry or some of the other major industries. When we look at best practices related to government relations, I came up with five different best practices. The first was use reliable big data for analytics, and yourself, you're probably working with a lot of big data. How important is it to have a good handle, understanding, and then also to projecting that big data to elected officials?
It's very important to have facts and background. I will say, the data is very important, but one of the things we like to tell APGA members, and I mean, I'll tell anybody that has an opportunity to engage an elected official or a policymaker, is data that's important to that person you're talking to. And so, big data is important, but if you've got a specific anecdote about Wilson, North Carolina, that's really going to resonate with Congressman Butterfield, just as an example, then be prepared for that, and be educated on that subject matter. Because, and I should say this too, um, lobbying, government relations can sometimes get a bad rap, but it's a constitutional right. It's in the Bill of Rights, in the first, um, gosh, I'm going to have a not a very good government relations person. I can't remember, but the first Bill of Right, the first whatever in the Bill of Rights, we have the right to petition, and so we're executing on our constitutional right. And so don't feel like it's a sleazy thing for you to have this conversation with an elected official or with a policymaker. It's fully within your purview. But to your first best practice there, be prepared, be educated, tell them something they would want to hear. And a lot of times we always hear that the folks that, when you look at Capitol Hill, you look at a Senate office or a representative office, you're not necessarily always going to meet with a senator or with a representative. You're going to meet with his or her staff. And that staff really likes those anecdotes, because 9 times out of 10, if their boss is going to give a floor speech, they may work that into that floor speech to say, Wilson, North Carolina delivers X number of decatherms to customers to make sure they're warm during the winter. Sorry, a little long winded, but hopefully that helps build out your first best practice.
Yeah, I think that's great to kind of tie that all together because, to your point earlier, you're going to be meeting with a lot of staff and aides. You probably don't always have FaceTime with a senator or congressman or an elected official, but if you can get that information to their team and their team incorporates that, it can really help fortify, what you're doing. With APGA, you have members that you're accountable to, and the second, best practices is tie results into actions with stakeholder management. So, you're trying to accomplish a mission to show those that support APGA, either being members or other entities that support the organization. Hey, listen, we're making an impact in our sector, and this is the things that we're doing. When it comes to really tying those actions into results, what's the best way to, do you communicate through a newsletter? Do you have an annual conference? How do you really showcase what you're doing both in government relations and also as an organization when it comes to the stakeholders that you represent?
Yeah, so we have both. We have
Hmm.
a couple of communications we send out. We have a quarterly printed communication, and then we have a couple of digital communications, one monthly, one weekly. I think when we talk about reporting out, I focus on, we have 4 meetings a year as well. So to your question about annual conference, we do have an annual conference each summer, but then we also have a government relations conference actually at the beginning of the year. So it's in a couple weeks. So juggling a lot of balls this week. So I'm glad I was able to find some time to have the conversation with you. But yeah, I try to target those 4 times we have those conferences to report out. And as an engineer, I struggle with this, and still to a certain degree struggle with, how do you capture success in a government relations framework? And there's obviously some quantitative metrics you can push out to let folks know how good or bad you're doing. You can talk about the engagements you had with policymakers, both elected officials as well as the folks in the regulatory world. You can talk about letters you sent, comments you sent. Those are all very good quantitative metrics to tell people what you're working on. The challenge is legislation is very lengthy process. I'll use this just as an example. Regulation, also very lengthy process, but you could work on a piece of legislation for 10 years and never see it pass. And so if you're identifying success as a bill getting signed by the president, you may never see that in your career, or if you're, however long you're with the organization. So that's a challenge to try to measure that. I think we try to capture, if we have a member testify in a conference hearing or a committee hearing on that bill, that's a measure of success that we like to talk about. If we have it introduced in a certain chamber, so kind of that first step in the bill process, that's a measure of success. And so it's kind of hard to strike that right balance. But at the end of the day, I think to this point, it's very important that you talk about government relations to, kind of to the previous conversation we had, show that you are adding value to your organization, as well as let folks know this is what we're working on. And from a trade association standpoint, make sure it affirm that it is what you need to be working on as you represent those folks here in DC.
Yeah, I think you would agree. Your pathway to success, it's not always going to the legislators and getting, to your point, getting a bill that becomes a law that's signed by the president, but also too, you're going to work with the regulatory agencies that are out there. You might also team with other organizations to do a bigger push. And the third best practice I had related to government relations is invest in state and local politics. And I've heard people say, all politics are local. And I think critical success happens was when you do focus on local and state. What are some of the things that can be done for an organization related to state? Sometimes with Pennsylvania has a full-time legislation, but some states have part-time. Some states are set up differently. How do you kind of navigate that across the different types of formats, let's say, and operate ways that states operate when it comes to government?
Yeah, that's a challenge, I think, for someone that's a full-time legislator.
Hmm.
A little bit easier because they're having challenges throughout the year that you can speak to them about. But with every level, I think it's finding out what's important to that individual, and really educating yourself on that. From a local and state perspective too, I think there's a little better opportunity to get to know those people because they're going to be closer to you. And so, sure, all representatives, or I'd say a lot of them, go home every weekend or at least spend a lot of time in the state or the district, senators and representatives. But some of that time is when they spend with their family. And so you don't have maybe the opportunity you would have to build a relationship with a state or local lawmaker. And so, but again, kind of the basis is know the issues important to them. If you're going to engage them, educate yourself on that to be prepared to have a conversation. I think one thing that's always interesting when it comes to politics is you never know when that local elected official will become a federal elected official. If you look at the track record of a lot of people in DC, they started in local politics. And so having those relationships whenever in their political campaign or political career could bode well for your future questions or future relationships. And by all means, don't I'm not encouraging people to get to know people just because they could be influential in the future. I mean, spend time with people you enjoy being with, but at the same time, if you are interested in government relations, you have a desire to be a voice in your community, this is one way to do it. And having relationships are good.
Yeah, I mean, you really never know because someone could be tapped to be part of the cabinet for a
Mhm.
president that gets elected. They could be, put on to, maybe they do run as a representative for a state or they run for Congress. They're on committees, maybe potentially they can be of influence. And then also, too, some of them also go into work for government agencies as well,
Mhm.
especially if their background is in a particular sector and they serve that way when it comes to federal agencies.
Mhm.
It's interesting, really, when you think about it. Is you never know who could be the next representative, elected representative, senator, or potentially become a president one day,
Mhm.
or maybe run an agency. So it's important to really cover that. My fourth best practice was build your in-house resources. And so when let's say if looking at organization structures that have government relations, typically you have a person like yourself who's really managing the team. You have a team that communicates, that works on gathering facts and getting information, outreach, doing events, webinars, doing, Capitol Hill visits or whatever they might be. What other resources typically would an organization have? Would you have someone, let's say a third party on K Street, or would you have third party legal representation that really kind of handles government versus the financial side of laws?
Yeah, a couple things. I think one I'll mention at the outset, and I don't know, I think people can see your Twitter handle, your Instagram handle.
Mhm.
The best resource I would say to invest in or spend time thinking about is social media. It's so powerful these days, even with elected officials, and not just the senators and representatives who are running campaigns, but also regulators. I mean, you look at Secretary Granholm, who's the Secretary of Energy, for instance. She's very active on Twitter. Her colleague, Secretary Buttigieg at the Department of Transportation, very active on Twitter. I mean, granted, those were both elected officials before they served as cabinet members, so
Mhm.
maybe some habitual, but at the same time, they're probably getting some advice to take that public persona or take that public outreach through Twitter, through social media. And so, you as an individual, you as working for a utility or for an energy company, I mean, the social media is a great opportunity to engage. It's not uncommon to tweet at a elected official, tweet at their Secretary of Energy, offer some perspective. I mean, are they going to read it? Probably not. But at the same time, it's a way for you to publicly say your opinion and get them in the tagline should they find it interesting or should they take an interest in it. The other two things you mentioned as well are definitely resources to have internally.
Mhm.
For us, we do have a contract lobbyist that supports our efforts, but we do a lot of our Capitol Hill advocacy, our regulatory advocacy on our own. And so we like to take pride in our work and our relationships and the capabilities we have as a small team. There's only three of us that do government relations for APGA, and so we take pride in kind of being that one-stop shop, with some support from the external. Now, the legal external is very important. Hopefully, you never have to use it, but there is the situation from a regulatory perspective that you would want to bring a lawsuit against the federal government because of an arbitrary and capricious rulemaking, or from a state perspective, if there's a state law and you want to kind of move it up the court of appeals chain, you're going to want that expertise that is in a lot of the law firms that you wouldn't have internal, most likely.
Yeah, and routinely we see that. We see sometimes things get elevated.
Mhm.
They might go. And I kind of work more around sometimes with OSHA. And it goes through a review process. It goes through really public comments, and then it goes through the committee. Sometimes those things could get elevated all the way to the Supreme Court. And
Mhm.
we've seen that happen even recently. We're currently experiencing one related to vaccine mandate.
Mhm.
Jeff had a great post here, Jeff. He's talking really about the information relayed to and a strong constituent group like our country's 1,000+ municipal gas system operators. Very good, Jeff. Um,
Oh, checks in the mail, Jeff. So
there,
thank
there you go. There you go. My last for government relations best practice. My last and fifth um, item I came up was operate for consistency and also continuity. It's important to be consistent, but also, like you had mentioned earlier, you never know who you're working with, where they might ultimately arrive at as a designation. So you need to make sure you're consistently working with these contacts, both state, local, and federal. But you need to make sure you have consistency. How hard is it not to get distracted?
It's very hard. It's very hard. I think, especially like I mentioned earlier, some of this legislation can take 10 years to pass. And as you can imagine, maybe historically it hasn't been quite the back and forth that we see today, at
Hmm.
least from a Capitol Hill perspective. But it's always been a little bit, some folks are in charge 1 year or for 4 years, and then, the other group's in charge for the next 4 years. And so you have to be consistent in your positions. I know elected officials get a lot of flack for going back and forth, changing perspective over their elected official career. But I think as an organization, you could also find yourself subject to that ridicule if you kind of change positions back and forth. And so one issue that we've been working on for a long, long time is related to refund authority for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Very wonky title, very wonky topic. I won't delve into it, but that's just the issue. And so we've remained consistent in that, our opinion of that, but at the same time, recognizing the quote strategy and how you engage elected officials on the topic could change. And so just using that example, you're going to talk differently to a Democratic elected official than you would a Republican elected official. It's nothing wavering on how you feel about the end goal. It's just how they, as an elected official and who they're representing, view the topic. So there's some flexibility in how you strategize or talk about the topic, but very important that you as an individual or as an organization in a government relations context remain consistent about your position.
So, for our final conversation topic here, related to government stakeholder relations and focus and effectiveness, what I wanted to talk with you about first is taking on that role as an advisor. How, what does that role look like as an advisor? How far can you go? And what are some of those limits that you can't, what's the line you can't cross over? Could you go into some detail on that?
Yeah. So your your characterization of me as an advisor is what I love.
Hmm.
I have folks on Capitol Hill that I enjoy having conversations with, enjoy meeting with, have folks in PHMSA and DOT. Jeff being a former one that I really enjoy being around and talking with and solving industry problems with. But my love is really educating and helping APGA members be that person.
Hmm.
I don't want to be that person. I want them to be that person. And frankly, because it makes more sense for them to be that person, because from a PHMSA perspective, they're the one operating the pipeline. From a legislative perspective, they're the one that the elected official is representing, not me. My elected officials are DC elected officials, not South Carolina, North Carolina, whatever it may be. And
Yeah.
so my really enjoyment is making those folks aware of the issue, helping them kind of think about the best way to talk about that issue with the person they're meeting with. And that's, I some people question why I'm an engineer, but I do government relations. I like to think of me engineering conversation and strategizing around the best way to approach a subject with a certain individual. So that, it's kind of a stretch from an engineering perspective. I don't think you learn any of that in your engineering classes, but it is kind of engineering a way to have a conversation and lines to cross. Obviously, the law is very specific on what you can and cannot do from a right to petition standpoint. So we're very aware of that. Have to make sure you report and record all your interactions with elected officials. If you do give monetary, financial contributions, you have to make sure you do all that stuff. It's very specific in the law, and to a certain degree, the government's done a really good job at making it easy to do that, to
Mm.
make sure you're within the law. But yeah, that is a concern or a focus that we have, to make sure we're within the law. And I'm trying to think of any other, quote, red lines that we would want to be aware of. I think one thing that I'll say too is for folks out there that have maybe never thought about having a conversation with an elected official, if you're an individual,
Mhm.
I would encourage you to do it. I mean, I think that me struggling to come up with red lines is hopefully an encouragement for you to know that it's not a big deal, that you do have the right to petition your elected officials, and you should do it. And I know for our industry, the natural gas industry, there are some challenges that we're facing right now. And I think getting our voice out there, making sure folks understand the important value the natural gas industry brings to Americans is critical. And you could have a really strong influence, especially if there's a multitude of you speaking into a lawmaker's perspective, to help them see the importance of natural gas, the importance of energy industry. And so, I think obviously you want to be educated, you want to be aware of the issue so you have a meaningful conversation, but don't be scared to have that conversation, to make that outreach.
That's a good point. I think when it comes, especially for myself, being a novice related to government relations, sometimes I don't understand exactly. And when you look at government relations, it's not, for most people, it's not an easy thing to understand.
Mhm.
We're used to certain rules and process and procedures regarding businesses and things like that. Carl Davenport had a really good question here. How do you interact, or how do you get involved in projects that affect the gas association, and related, obviously, railroads? I'm sorry, roadways, buildings, complexes, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
To a certain degree, we leave a lot of those local conversations to the utility that's dealing with the conversations with the building commissions and the railroads, if it is a railroad project. I think for us, we like to take a national perspective on those conversations. And so, for instance, pipeline permitting. So we as public utilities aren't going to necessarily build a pipeline that has to have a nationwide permit, or go through the Clean Water Act, do an environmental impact statement, whatever regulation that you have to build build a big pipeline like a transmission company would have to do. But we recognize that there is desire for natural gas capacity in a lot of the areas where our members operate. And so more pipelines would help meet that capacity, would help meet that demand. And so we take a national perspective to encourage good permitting good permitting regulations. So obviously you want to make sure you're meeting the environmental requirements needed to protect our lands and waterways, but at the same time know that there are people that are demanding natural gas, and you can build a pipeline prudently, and so do it. And so, and similar with a railroad, I haven't worked with the trade association that represents the railroad in this role, but in previous roles, we've had conversations with that trade association to say, hey, nationally, don't you think it makes sense for maybe this regulation around pipe sleeves to be different, or something like that, just to kind of help,
Mm-hmm.
frame the question and frame those conversations at a national level. So hopefully that helps, Carl.
Yeah, I think this is where your engineering side comes into play because you're talking very complex technical, even though some people might say it's just a pipeline. You don't realize the engineering and technology that goes into laying a pipeline, the management of it, the operation of it, and the safety aspect of it is super critical because no company wants to have a failure
Right.
because not only the loss of property and life is critical, is really obviously bad, but if you have loss of life, that can be devastating to a company, and also to that individual and that community as well. When I look at focus and effectiveness in this last topic we have, engagement with the stakeholders. There is kind of a basic process, and some of the things that I had laid out here is the identification of government stakeholders. You really need to kind of assess exactly who are the important contacts related to local, state, federal government, and kind of have, I would guess, like dossier that's developed over them. Is that a good way to phrase that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, again, kind of to my love of advising. This is where I really enjoy having the conversations and strategizing around who you should know, who you should kind of have on your short list. So, from an energy perspective, there's Senate committees, there's how congressional committees, so in the House of Representatives committees that they focus on energy. And those are the contacts that you would want to know from a state perspective. You obviously have state energy offices. You want to know those individuals, the local perspective, utility board, city council, depending on how your city is structured. So you want to spend a little time thinking about who are the players in the area you want to engage from a government relations standpoint, and you're spot on learning a little bit about their background. I know, and it doesn't have to be anything complex. It could be who you play golf with, or maybe someone you went to high school with. And so
University, yeah,
Mhm.
that type of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, alma maters. I mean, I went to an SEC school, so I definitely understand the value in being the same graduate as someone else. And so, and again, to the point earlier of you never know where folks may go. There's individuals that I went to college with that are friends of mine because I was in school with them, and they went to DC and I went to Chevron, but now we're in DC together. And so you never know how how paths may cross in the future. But I think, kind of building off the best practice topic that we started with,
Mhm.
Jim, being educated and being prepared is key. And I would probably say that's probably the most important thing as you think about engaging government relations officials, whether it's a staff, whether it's the actual senator, if you're fortunate enough, or the congressman, if you're fortunate enough to meet with him or her. They're very busy people. I won't deny that. Some of them may have egos and think they're a little busier than they are, but at the end of the day, they are very busy. And so they will appreciate you more than anything if you come to them prepared and ready to, lay out your request if that's what it is, or lay out why you're important to them if you're doing a stakeholder introduction type meeting. And so educating yourself is very critical.
I think that's very important, and it really kind of feeds in related to the communication. As
Mhm.
much as you want to talk to a representative or a congressman, it's going to be difficult. You're going to work with either their chief of staff, if that's the right terminology for it, but also too, you're going to work with their staff, and you're more or less communicating with that individual or those individuals
Mhm.
before you get an opportunity to work with a representative, or a congressman. But ultimately, I'm sure that you've had the opportunity to work directly with the elected official. Is that correct?
Yeah, a few times.
Okay. So I guess in my thought process is that if you do get that opportunity, that's a great sign. The second thing is it's more of a rarity to
Right.
work directly. You're going to work more with the team, the staff, or the chief of staff, more so than you're going to work directly with that elected official. So
Yeah. And don't think badly about yourself if you get that opportunity. I mean, I won't tell an elected official this, but 9 times out of 10, that staff person is the one doing the work. They're the ones writing the bills. They're the ones giving the talking points to the elected officials. And so they're the ones moving the goal. They're the ones moving the chess pieces around, so to speak. So those are the ones, frankly, you want to have the relationship with. And I, if you look at, again, kind of going back to the conversation we had about, you never know where careers may take people.
Mhm.
I mean, there's numerous staffers that are now elected officials. There's a woman running for Senate in Alabama right now that was, I think she was chief of staff for Senator Shelby. So you never know how those relationships may pan out. And so yeah, don't discount yourself if you are just meeting with a staff person.
Excellent, and that feeds into my last and final on this topic, is related to evaluating the stakeholders, understand their roles and responsibilities. So having a good understanding of exactly what each of the staff members do, the influence they have on the elected official. But the other thing too that I have found really interesting and really doing some quick research on this topic was that you really need to have a good understanding when it comes to, I'm almost at a point saying a flow chart, to know how this committee, that committee, how they interact, how things move through. Because the frustrating thing is you think that you're going at a certain angle and you find out that you really didn't understand exactly how a committee worked or how the sausage is made. And all of a sudden you've wasted so much time on individuals. And again, I'm not saying it's a waste of time, but you might have had some opportunity where you should have focused in a different direction to be able to get your topic, your message, or maybe get your language into a bill that becomes ultimately a law. And it could be frustrating if it winds up you've gone around in a circle, went nowhere, and all that time, like you said, it could take years. It could take sometimes months. It takes years. And a lot of times when we see now these bills are mega bills where there are thousands of pages and
Yeah.
everything is jammed in there. And that can that can create an opportunity where you can get lost in all that, enormity when it comes to a bill.
Yep.
So, is it practical to really have that understanding and flow everything out?
No, it's very practical too. I
Mhm.
think, I don't know all who's in the audience today, but not, there's a good chance that you're represented by a trade association that has folks like me. So maybe you figure that out first before you dive into the complexity of some of the law making. But again, if it's interesting and you want to do it, by all means, there's definitely a lot you can dive into, and like you said, Jim, kind of map out the right strategy. And I think that's where, from an engineering perspective, it is kind of interesting to see how things work and what's the best way to address the challenge you have, should it be passing legislation or getting a regulation approved, whatever it may be. But I'm just trying to think of an anecdote to maybe capture that a little bit. And I know, for instance, there was an issue that we were working on, that we had a congressman that was that represented one of our bigger members, and we were hoping he would introduce this bill. Well, he's not on the committee that ultimately would oversee kind of the next step in the process after introduction is marking it up. And so it's kind of, you had to think through the strategy of, right, is he the right person? Can we think of somebody else? And so just kind of thinking through all that questions and figuring out who's the right person to, quote, champion this piece of legislation in that instance is an exercise that you should go through.
Yeah, and I think to your point, instead of tackling it, if you're part of a trade association, especially that has a government relations, has a strong voice for your industry that you work in, with state, local, and federal contacts and representatives, that is critical to take advantage of that, because if this can be very cumbersome, to your point, in most cases, it doesn't automatically mean it's going to generate a revenue or it's trackable back to revenue. And it's a long-term venture that you're looking to do. So, utilizing some of the trade associations out there that do this is great. And with the enormity, how many, when you represent who you represent, you're talking about a very large block of national voters and, people that are influential in different, in your industry especially. And that there's power with that, especially when government officials are looking for the next election cycle and what kind of support they might get, or what type of voting opportunities they can get by championing certain certain
Mhm.
policies, procedures, and things like that. Stuart, what an awesome conversation we had. I appreciate you
Yeah.
going through a lot of this to kind of help me understand, but I think also to the audience understand. Is there anything that we didn't talk about related to government relations that you would want to leave with the viewers?
I'm trying to think. We've covered a lot of ground, so
Yeah.
I think we've plowed enough soil for today. But
Yeah.
I'm
I was going to,
always happy to answer questions, or I can share email and all that fun stuff too.
yeah. And Jim from Coffee with Jim and James, he said, "Thank you for the information, the value brought to the them and also to the trade associations." Yeah, Stuart, how can viewers get in contact with you? I know you're on LinkedIn, but is there any other ways to get in contact with you and also too with the APGA?
Yeah, so you can start with LinkedIn, just as opposed to me trying to spell out all my email and the crazy way my name is spelled. So definitely find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to start the conversation there. And I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but I do have a Twitter account, and I kind of tend to use more industry post on Twitter and LinkedIn. If you want to see pictures of my kids or what I'm eating, you can follow me on Instagram. But that's social media, like I said, is a powerful tool. I like to use it, so please use it that way. Our website is a little easier. It's just apga.org, and a lot of information. We actually relaunched our website December of last year, so we're really proud of how it looks and the resources that are available there. um, so check it out. There is a tab specifically on advocacy that we kind of own as the government relations team, but there's also operations and safety, which is kind of the other leg of the APGA stool. And so there's a lot of folks that are probably in the audience or in that operations and safety job role for their organization. So a lot of good resources there. That group is really the one that deals a lot with the PHMSA, with the DOT, that side of the business. So encourage you to take a look at that. We do also have APGA Twitter and APGA LinkedIn, APGA Facebook. So easy to find us in multiple ways.
Excellent, excellent. Stuart, thank you so much for this opportunity. What a great conversation. And hopefully you and I can get back together for another episode down the road here.
Yeah, sounds good, Jim. There, it's a Capitol Hill, DC's it's churning 24 hours a day, so plenty of stuff we can talk about whenever.
Yeah, especially with the midterm elections coming up.
I'm not going to talk about that. I'll let somebody else guess who's going to
there,
take
there,
over
there
and
you
all that
go.
stuff.
All right, Stuart. Well, hey, have a great day.
You too, Jim. Thanks again.
On the next episode of Build Out, my guest will be Ravi Nagarajan. Ravi and I will have a conversation on key account management. See you next Wednesday, January 19th at noon Eastern.